In this video, I'm going to show you how to make these micro aerial shells. And they might be tiny, but considering their size, their performance is honestly incredibly impressive. Stay tuned. The body of these is going to be a plastic drinking straw. In a prior video, I used these to make firecrackers, and this is the same process. Some people in that video commented negatively about the use of plastic, so if you have a plastic aversion, use paper instead. The stars are crackling stars pulled from some defective fireworks. They're very, very small, and that's why they're useful for this application. Other types of stars could certainly be used, but for demonstration, I'm just going to use these. Start by pouring some of the stars into the body of the straw. I made a mess doing this and overfilled it. My excuse is that I was working on camera. At first I wanted to use this many stars, but I think it's too many. We need room for an adequate burst charge. This looks more appropriate. Speaking of burst charges, I'm going to be using two different types. The first is black powder. This is 4F-GoX, and the corned powder is nice here because it has a higher power density. I'm going to be using this very precise priming flask I have. I made this out of a shed deer antler. You can see that I've just filled up the shell. Now I'm going to shake it around to evenly distribute the stars in the burst charge. And there you have it. And here's the other fuel I'll be using. It's the exact same mixture I used in my video on how to make firecrackers, and here's a card to that. The process is the same as with the black powder. Simply put in a couple scoops of burst charge, and then shake it up to get the stars and the powder evenly distributed. The longer you make these and the more burst charge you add, the louder they will be, and I suggest doing that if you want an impressive display. But they will work if you make them almost as small as you can imagine. In this case, I went for a little more middle-of-the-road approach. They could be made smaller and could be made larger, but this moderate size performs pretty well. I'm using a small piece of Visco cannon fuse as a time fuse. You can see how I cut the end at a sharp angle to expose as much powder grain as possible to ensure good ignition. The proper thing to do is to take that cut end and dip it in a black powder slurry and let it dry. That primes it and ensures good ignition, but I'm too lazy to be bothered. Then just seal off the fuse end with a little bit of hot glue, and this shell is almost done. As you can see, I'm struggling with this glue gun a little bit. Guess you work with what you got. And there these are, all plugged up. You can see the 3 done with black powder and the 3 done with flash. And you can see that only a very short amount of fuse is sticking out of these. If you wanted to use these as ground devices, you could, but you would need to use a longer fuse. The last thing I do on each shell is reinforce it with a little bit of tape. This isn't strictly necessary, but it helps to make sure that they have a tight enough fit in the launch tube that they get launched nice and high, and it makes them break louder and larger. Speaking of which, in the thumbnail of this video you probably saw a much shorter launch tube than I showed in the very beginning. That's because it's more aesthetically pleasing, but the longer launch tube will launch these higher, so that's what I'm actually going to use. A launch tube the size of one depicted in the thumbnail would also work. I just decided to use a longer one. You can see that the tube I'm going to be using is the tube from a Bic pen. I think these are common enough, and they just so happen to be the perfect size to launch these little shells. So in total I have 6 shells, 3 with flash and 3 with black powder. And the black powder ones did not ignite the stars properly. This is a fault of the stars, and not the process. Black powder is perfectly acceptable, and this is more of a fluke than anything else. But the flash powder is more exciting anyway. As I mentioned earlier in the video, other star compositions could be used, and you might not have ignition issues with the black powder. Anyway, you can see that I'm plugging the end of the launch tube with some hot glue and allowing it to cool. This is going to function more like a single-shot mortar than a reloadable canister shell, so I'm going to drill a small fuse hole in the bottom of the tube, and I'm doing that with a hot needle. When you're doing this, make sure you do it away from the shells you just made. If they did go off, they probably wouldn't hurt you because they're so small, but good practices must be followed at all times. If this were ever scaled up or loose compositions were laying around, it could result in serious issues, so just be safe. And there you can see the fuse hole I melted with the needle. I decided to decorate this pen tube with a little bit of black electrical tape just to make it look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. And now that I've covered the fuse hole up with tape, I'm going to reburn it. Here you can see how a thin fuse fits in that fuse hole nicely. And that's the first step in loading this mortar. Make sure that enough of the fuse is in there to provide proper ignition. But before we get to loading it, let's glue it down to a base. Make sure that the card you use for the base is sturdy and broad enough that it provides a good and stable foundation for the mortar tube. And once the glue is dried, we're ready to load and fire this thing. Considering it's just a pen tube and a little bit of cardstock, I think it looks pretty cool. For a lift charge, I'm going to be using that same 4F black powder I used in the burst charge of the first three. Again, the corned powder is nice for the power density to get these launched nice and high. You can see that I'm using a piece of straw like I used for the body of the shells to measure out the powder. Just a moderate amount should be used, and keep in mind, don't use flash powder. That's a really good way to blow up your mortar tube. Once your fuse and lift charge are in place, simply drop in the shell. And this is ready to be set off. I expected these to go high, but not quite this high. Don't worry, the other footage will be better. There you can see those ignition issues I was talking about with the stars. I think they just need a little bit more heat to get properly ignited, and that's why the flash powder is able to do so. And yes, that fuse didn't ignite. I think this was honestly my fault, in that I got hot glue on the fuse. But again, as I mentioned, priming with a black powder slurry will ensure that this does not happen at all. That was the first one with flash powder, and you can see that the stars ignited a little bit better, but they honestly just don't perform very well. And finally, I did actually have one perform as intended, which you saw in the beginning of the video. It's a shame they didn't all perform that way, but not to pass blame, I do believe that this is a fault in the stars and not in the process, so I can in good confidence say that this is a good process to follow. And you can see that that mortar tube and fuse hole are not much worse for wear after 6 hole shots. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I thank you for sticking around till the end, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks.